I'm actually going to be working with my colleague Desmond Latham, who's going to be supporting me on the review today. And so I'll start off and then Des will continue and also share a couple of tools. First of all, I wanted to say thank you very much to Lena, because just listening to her presentation just really highlighted how rich the story is in terms of the coverage that we can actually be doing, the kinds of stories we can be looking at, and the ways that we can actually cover China and North Africa. So Lena, thank you very much for that. I just think that there's a mountain of stories out there that we can really look at. And so for today's session, really, I mean, Des and I have split it up. And I wanted to, first of all, start off by saying, I really want to congratulate everyone whose stories we had the opportunity to review as part of this process. I want to say congratulations because we, Frayintermedia, recently did research for UNESCO on the impact of COVID on journalists and journalism. And one of the big challenges really was the ability to be able to go out and get stories, in the sense of being able to talk to people, being able to get information on the ground. So I think that we're mindful of the fact that you produce these stories under really, really difficult circumstances. We're also mindful of the fact that right now, just globally, we're finding a huge decrease in trust in media. And so your kind of reporting, this really factual, evidence-based reporting, is more important than ever before. We're seeing a decline and a news avoidance, just generally in terms of the way the media is reporting the story. And so I wanted to start off by just acknowledging the conditions in which you had to do the story, and what was happening. And then I wanted to kind of just talk about generally, in writing these stories, in China and Africa stories, there are a couple of things that the grant making process actually looks for. And of course, what we're looking for are stories that haven't really been published before, stories that bring to the audience new insight, new knowledge, and really cover an issue that's really important. And so for us, the starting point at reviewing the stories really is to ask, what is the best practice in publishing stories such as these? Why do these stories matter? How can we tell these stories in more interesting ways? And then obviously, what is the news hook? To tell these stories during the pandemic was a challenge in and of itself. And so I wanted to take a step back and just talk generally that when you look at the award-winning reportage, when you look at stories that really stand out, for me, the one thing that is consistent in award-winning stories is the ability to be able to find really the intersection, the nexus between the hard news and the analysis and narrative. So to be able to not just tell us the facts, but to bring those facts to life with people in your stories, to be able to analyze and to really answer a critical question for the audience in terms of why does the story matter, what is important about the story. And so in reviewing the stories, what we're really looking for are the building blocks of great stories. And those building blocks are a wide range of sources, right, who offer differing insights. Clearly, the story needs to have interesting ideas with a strong news hook, even if, as it is in this case, it's an issue-based story. We're looking for background and context so that the reader can really have a good understanding of why the story is important. In the actual flow of the story, we're looking for a logical story structure, and then most importantly, a really engaging story format on the right platform. So we had some written stories, we had some video stories, So a range of different presentations. But increasingly, because we know that our audiences really consume news and information across different platforms, we were also looking for interesting use of tools to be able to present information in interesting ways, with infographics, with audio, with video. And so these are the kinds of things that we really wanted to be able to have a look at. So we were looking at interesting ways to be able to tell that story. We recognize that it's not good enough to have a great idea or interesting stories or great storytelling techniques. You really do then need to be able to tell a story that serves your audience, fits within your organization's editorial code, takes the issue forward, right, and then engages the audience in a very interesting way. Those are all of the elements that we were really looking at in giving this feedback, in looking at the stories, in reviewing the stories. And so just a couple of questions, right? The story must really include what is the context? Did we make people care by showing and not telling them, but really kind of unpacking the issues in a way that was interesting for them? Did we show impact on the lives of real people? Did we explain and really get our audiences to understand the issues and why these issues were important? In an era of misinformation and disinformation, I think one of the things that really journalists need is to be able to be critical of the information they're getting and as much as possible to verify it. And so wanted to make sure that the information was factual, that the sources were credible, that we were really kind of supporting that. Do we attribute information to the source so that even when we're doing analysis, we can see that the information that is being shared is evidence-based? And then how did we use other storytelling tools as much as possible? And so these are all of the elements that we were just generally looking for and trying to pull out of it. In this day and age, we know that to tell compelling stories, it's really not enough to simply give the facts, to say he said, she said, to put all of the information out there and let the audience do the hard work of interpreting it, but to really extract what is important and then from that process to really pull out the story and to tell the audience, whether they're a listener or a viewer or a reader, why the story is important and what matters. And so I'm going to call Desmond now. We didn't try to be very, very specific and try to be able to talk to the issues as generally as possible, but we do want to be able to be quite interactive, and Desmond also has pulled out a couple of tools that we might be able to use. So Desmond, over to you.
Bonjour, je m'appelle Desmond. Thank you. Very happy to be here. And afraid I do not speak Arabic, but I had Mr. Google help me a little bit a few minutes ago. So I'm sure after this, you'll give me pointers. Actually, Rua, I heard you say ajudi, but it's le wujudi. So I'm sure the finer points of Arabic and French, we'll need pointers about that, let alone discussing journalistic tools. So I tend to speak fast. I'm a broadcaster. But what I'll do is I'll slow down a little bit because I can hear the interpreters banging away on their typewriters and perhaps on their desks in frustration. So, merci beaucoup, Ivan. I don't know who the other interpreter is, just says kudo, but I hope that we will make some sense. I read through all the presentations and watched all the presentations, the broadcasts that were the applicants put through. And I had quite a few questions and comments after doing so, which I hope makes some sense. Also, being an African journalist, my experience is telling the stories to the world from the bottom end of Africa. And you are telling the stories to the world from the top end of Africa. So we both have a similar problem, broadly speaking, which is that I may be talking to you in a colonial language called English, but my first language I learned was isiZulu and Xhosa. So I actually dream in an African language called Zulu. So I appear before you as a European-looking person, but the irony is that skin colors can be deceptive. So in saying that, I'm pointing this out, that one of the things that I'm very aware of and we are aware of is a Western-dominated narrative, or a narrative that comes from the English-speaking world, or a narrative that comes from a non-Indigenous speaking world, whatever those things are that you can paint together. So I wanted to just, before I continue talking and comment about the stories, is just say that one of the difficulties we have as journalists and as editors is diversity. And I'm looking at the stories that were written from various parts of the Maghreb, which are concentrating on countries. Tunisia, Morocco were the main countries, Algeria. There was no Mauritanian story that I could see, or Libyan. And that, according to the definition, is part of the Maghreb. So please set me right if someone is from those two countries that are missing on this group. So it's really important to mention that before I carry on, because I'm going to show you a presentation, and you know, the real world has an unfortunate tendency to damage the perceptions that we have of an erroneous world. So as soon as we think we've formed an opinion based on what we think is the truth, because what we've been told, the real world tends to come along and change everything. So as journalists, I always feel that we should be looking at the real world, not what people say is the real world. And that may be stating the obvious. However, from some of the material that I read, there seems to be a progression towards quoting what people say is the truth rather than finding it out. And of course, as experienced people in this call know, the longer you do that, the more dangerous it is for you and society. So that's in essence how I approached looking at the stories and the comments that I can make. I have a presentation, which I know from experience, we trained in Alexandria, and I know that the Arabic and French translators liked the presentation because while I was saying things, they could actually read, and it would help. So if you don't mind, can I share that presentation? When we looked at the stories, there are a number of things that are quite difficult to kind of approach. The first is that the person who's being hired or is being asked to do a story is aware of what they should be doing based on the output. In other words, who they're doing it for. So what people tend to do, journalists particularly, and especially in developing world journalism, is to approach the story from self-censorship first, from not doing damage to themselves as a storyteller. So the context of what we're discussing here is so important, because it's not just the fact that the journalist that is on the call, or some of them, will feel obligated. They will feel pressure to write a story that views the relationship between China and the Maghreb positively versus what they really think. And the hypothesis in what we do, what we think is going on as thinking people, is what our brothers and sisters do when they sit down to look at our stories, or when they would want to comment on some of the sectors of construction, some of the stories of construction, some of the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRIs, as Lena has called it. So the context I'm aware of, and we'll talk a little about it now. The second thing is, why do people care about what you've written or what the story is that you've told? And by the people, I'm talking about your audience first, not the investor, not the sponsor. You know, would your family watch this, and why? And if they did watch it, what would they say to you afterwards in the quiet of your kitchen where there's no one listening? Would they congratulate you, or would they ask you some really difficult questions? Secondly, or thirdly, how do you show the impact on people? When a senior official says something to us that does not imply an impact. It implies a perception. So the important thing is to describe an impact. And the real way that we can do that is, even in lockdown, is ask people what the impact is. And that is a source. It's not scientific. You're not doing research and a survey. But the impact, the people would tell us what they think about the new bridge, or the multiple residencies, or the use of southern Algerian towns to build residential area, or whatever it would be. Then the information verification. We have information that is critical. We are given data and stats. We find it. Did we verify? When someone says this is the third biggest mosque in the world, did we make sure that it wasn't just CNN writing? Then do we attribute to source? When someone makes an unverified statement like, this is really good, who says? Why do they say that? And lastly, the storytelling tools. This is, for me, telling our story as Africans is one of the fundamental truths here. We are a vast nation of disparate, diverse people who do not sit in one place. And to tell the story, we have to place people inside geographies. We must be able to identify in our minds, we must see the region that we're talking about in our heads when we discuss it. So we need to then compare it with other regions. So it's not just the data, but the smell of the dust, if you like, the scene. How do we compare this scene with that scene? And that is very much part of the storytelling tool, which comes from our eyes and ears. Now, because you all wrote these things during lockdown, like you, I hope, in our country, we had a group of people called essential service workers. So in South Africa, journalists were regarded as medics. We were allowed to travel around throughout the entire period of lockdown. But I know that in different countries, slightly different rules apply. So I would be interested to hear, just out of interest, in the question time, or perhaps when we have comment, if you as journalists were regarded as essential service workers during the pandemic, if and when you were locked down. And I know we also had different layers and different levels of lockdowns where our movement was restricted. So as journalists here in South Africa, we spent a lot of time traveling around, and unfortunately to say, a lot of our colleagues died because of COVID, especially camera operators in television. A number of what we know as ENG, camera operators, died of COVID because, of course, they were always on the streets being exposed. So part of telling the story is having the video and the audio and the infographic, the map, the animation. We no longer are telling stories just because we have a print product or a web product. We are now having to represent the story and its various parts, if you like, through different techniques. So this has taken us to a new place where part of doing an analysis is a hypothesis. And I'm not sure how to translate that into Arabic. I'm sure it's being done now, but it's a Greek phrase, obviously, but it's been anglicized and used by the French. The hypothesis is, what do you think is going on? The big important thing for us as journalists is we start with a theory or an hypothesis. This is what I think is happening. And often, I'm sure you'll agree, you change your mind while you're investigating, because you can have a perception and a preconception, and then you have a change based on what you know and what you learn. So during the lockdown period, it's been very hard for us as journalists to test our hypothesis, because we often are not seeing things anymore. We're being told things at a distance. So what was the hypothesis of your topic? For the 6 pieces that I got, I wrote notes and so on. So each one of those people, I hope I'm going to send them back to the administrators, and hopefully they do share with you the specific things I've said on each of the pieces. Not a lot of material there, just a few ideas. But the one thing that I noticed was hypothesis is missing. As I've said with reality, it's a hard place with sharp edges. And if we wander around thinking it's a lovely romantic village, this place called planet Earth, you tend to run into a sharp end of something quite quickly. And I was concerned that the 5 W's and an H, who, why, what, where, when, how, we're not always addressed in a broad way. So I've got here's a paragraph from one of the pieces. Observers and researchers unanimously agree that the turning point in Moroccan-Chinese relations, which contributed to the development of popular cultural visions, blah, blah, was the official visit of King Mohammed VI to China in May 2016. So my question is, who are these observers? Who are they? Who are these researchers? So I accept that at times we can write and say, I think that the world is round. But someone would then say to me, who are you to say that the world is round? You need to attribute the material and a quote that is testable in some way. In our world, the way it works is that if you cannot swear in court that it is true, you need to attribute it to someone. So in other words, if you don't see it, Yasser or Raoul, if you don't see it, then you have to attribute it. So who are these people? Why was it a turning point? The big question that everyone asks when they're 3 years old of their parents is why? You have to go to sleep. Why? So when we're training journalists, the big question that I always ask them is why? They say something, I say, why? Why is it important? Why was it a turning point? What exactly happened? So the reason why we do that in hypothesis versus puff piece. Puff piece is, I love you all. It's wonderful. It's propaganda. Sign here and I'll get a free trip to Beijing or to Washington, or whatever it is. That's a puff piece. Yeah, you'll write nice things for me. Thank you very much. Sign here, sign here. We're going to give you $5,000 for the trip. Hope you enjoy it. It's going to be lovely when you get back. So that's a kind of journalism that we all obviously despise. But we need to know, who says it's a turning point? What happened that made this a turning point before 2016? Why was it not a turning point before? What happened in the meeting? What do people on the ground think about this? So observers agreed unanimously that the turning point was this meeting. Do the people on the ground think it's a turning point? Or do they think, what do they think? So on the pieces that I read, nowhere did I get a feeling that I was understanding what the person who's a Tunisian actually thinks about the investment, or an Algerian or Moroccan. What do they think about the investment? Those, the 3 countries that I read, as I said, I didn't see anything from Mauritania. I may have missed it, so apologies. What do they say about all of this? What were the several agreements in which sector? So at the end, in addition, 2 sides signed several agreements in sectors of innovation. Why is that mentioned? Why do we need to know about the agreements, and what kind of innovation are we talking about? What is so important about that? Le chat is playing games now, my cat. Then the second thing is data comparisons in all the pieces. So often in the stories I read that there would be a list of deliverables, but there was no comparison on that deliverable. There was done, a couple of stories did compare time zones or timing. So this much was spent then and that much now. But there was no clarity on why was this being done? What does it mean? If China is spending, the PRC invested 24 billion in Algeria in the latter period of the investment process. But previously they did not spend as much. Was this, what does that all mean for the Algerians? What does it mean for the Algerian on the street? How many jobs were created by all of this big money being thrown around here? What do they think about it? What are the people saying about it? What are the social and civic folks and the organizations saying about all of these things. So where the money is spent rather than just the amount is important when you start looking at big figures, because the bigger the number gets, the less real it gets for most people. $110 billion. Visualize it. Well, it's quite hard. $10, okay, I can visualize that. So explaining the data and presenting the data in a way, numerically, where you can, even in a very, very, a person who's trained in accountancy needs some kind of comparison. This compares to that. So I thought that that could be fleshed out. That could be used a lot more in storytelling. Compare data and then explain what it means, not just say, well, that money was spent. Because that's the PR copy. That's from the Treasury statement. The minister says, was very nice. What does the sharp end real world mean? What actually happened? So you've got patterns of expenditure. The patterns of expenditure imply strategic and tactical logic. So when someone spends or changes expenditure, there's a reason for that. They don't just wake up some morning and say, today we're going to be spending $10 billion on Mauritania for their iron and possibly salt, which the Americans buy from the Mauritanians for their winter streets. What does it mean? Why? What's the difference? What's happened over the years? Why are they more interested now in doing this? What has happened in the world? Because these are world stories that you're doing. This is not just the story of a region. This is a story of the globe. So you have to fit the globe into what's going on here to explain it. Then there's substantial difference, and it was mentioned by Lena, and all the stories that I read, and even the TV programs that I saw, mentioned this but didn't deal with it because it's a hot potato. The idea, okay, trade imbalance. There's a trade imbalance. And then that was it. Okay, let's stop right there. And we're not going to say anything more. And now let's talk about something else. So in African terms, the trade imbalances destroy local business. It's as simple as that. The more shoes you buy from Shanghai, the fewer cobblers and tailors work in Algiers. It's a very simple equation. So significant trade surplus and the imbalance is growing is a danger strategically to the labor force in a country. That's a fact. Okay. So what's going to happen? What does it mean? That's the story here. The story is the trade imbalance is a fact. No one is arguing. The reason why it's an imbalance is the story. Significant trade surplus, significant trade imbalance is something that people go to war over history. It's what caused the Americans to become independent largely. It's the British kept wanting them to buy more of their materials that they were manufacturing or starting to manufacture or exporting from India. We live in the same kind of world still. There's import, export, and there's imbalances. Why? What does this mean for me as a nation state reading this story? So that I thought was somewhere where all of the writers could have really dug in and said, right, I've identified that the export imports work of the following way. And it's economic stories that you're doing largely. There was only one kind of social story. Even there was economic, financial facts in it. What do you think? What is your hypothesis? We are thinking people as journalists, and we want to change our minds and everyone else's mind. So how do we then go about comparing that? So the easy way, the easiest way, which is doesn't hurt you at first, because I understand that our editors and our publishers have issues with some of the things that we produce because of the ownership structure, government interference, oppressive regimes, etc., etc. But given that, what can I say in a comparison that no one will argue with me about? And that is the selection of information based on the reasonable logic that you can prove and that is a fact that no one can dispute. Once you lay that out in data terms, it's very hard for someone who's arguing with you to continue arguing with you. And that's what, as journalists, we need to get people to, we need to bump them a little bit so that they think a little more. Then the next one I have here is, where are the people? There were no quotes from workers. And I understand that you're doing high-level stories, but at the same time, the only way you can really understand or get a story out about the effect of finance and economics and investments, especially involving nation states and especially involving outsiders because of our colonial history, is to ask people what they think and then to represent some of the things that people are talking about. Because we have our noses on the ground, and we as journalists, whether we're locked away or not because of COVID, we need, and we do understand what the people, and again, Lena was kind of referring to this without saying exactly what people are saying. There's this disconnect between what the officials in our world say and what the people think. Now, if you take that to its next step, which is you need to kind of find a representative person to explain in common language what this big picture thing looks like for most people. And this is dangerous for us because it's opinion and it's subjective. So as journalists, we tend to go after people who want to say things, or we think they should be saying things that we want them to say to prove what it is that we are writing. So and you and I know as journalists, that's a big problem. And you and I know as journalists, I grew up in an apartheid regime run by a technical one-party state that was a police state and racist. I know what happens when it's hard to write about things. My generation were detained, shot, murdered, etc. So what I'm saying as a journalist, I'm not pretending that it's not hard. I'm just saying that we need to know that what is the average person doing? The administrators and the bureaucrats, the technocrats, they sing many songs, normally of praise. But what do the normal people think? So, for example, the trade deficit with China was one of the chief contributors to Tunisia's general trade imbalance in 2018, which constituted 1.8 billion out of 6.6. So around 1/3 of Tunisia's trade imbalance was, in 2018, was to one country, which often happens in the developing world, doesn't it? So what I said to you earlier, that means someone down the road who owns a shop doesn't own a shop anymore. The cobbler, the tailor, the farmer, something that's been imported has replaced what they used to do. Now, I'm not suggesting that we become old-fashioned and fight development. I'm just saying to you that this story is very complex. And part of our cultures as nation states is built into the work we do. So if the work we do is being changed by an outsider coming in, working with a select group of people who are called the ministers or the politicians or the financiers, are affecting our whole culture, and we keep talking about it as journalists as if it isn't because it's too sensitive, then we are not finding out and we're not explaining what the people are really thinking about it. Now, this is a dangerous ground I'm on here because it's not easy to do this. Some countries, they invest in journalism just so that the truth does never come out. Many countries do it. So how far do we go down the road writing about what people are saying before it becomes perceived as anti-something? So I'd suggest adding a voice that is in the stories that you're doing that we're missing, where there's diverse voices. So you can use an alternate voice saying, this is great, but that may not be great. So you can then break up some of these storylines that you're getting about how wonderful it is that the construction companies based in Beijing, wherever they come from, are building this thing down the road. But then you have to ask the difficult question: who's paying? Who actually pays for that? So who paid for the mosque? The Great Mosque of Algiers, the biggest mosque in Africa. Did the Chinese pay for it? Did the IMF pay for it? No, it was the Algerians paying for it. So the storyline that I read there was very much based upon the idea that this is a fantastic thing. Hold on, who's paying? Where's the money coming from? It's public money spent on the project, and the project costs doubled over the period of the construction, which, by the way, you and I know often happens. The project starts at X billion and it ends up at Y billion. Double, triple, quadruple. Always, actually. Very seldom does the project cost equal the final cost. The estimated cost equal the final. So what is the interest on the debt? How long will the interest be paid off? So I thought that that's more of that, we could investigate more of that side in the discussions that I saw, that drill down more into the numbers. Because we were asking a question about what is the strategic aim of the investment. People who do ROI, return on investment logic, or build investments, they have a strategy. They didn't, as I said, they don't wake up one morning and say, Algeria is a beautiful country. I want some of my money to go to Algeria. No, these people are development aged. They're saying, I think that Tunisia and Algeria in particular, and maybe Morocco, are very, very strategically important to me, because I would like, what do I want? What do I have? What can I give them? What can they give me? And more importantly, where are they? So the stories, I'd like to see and like the idea that there was a lot of discussion of detail. All of the stories had really well sourced detail of facts. And then the missing thing for me was, why is China focusing a lot of its investment on Tunisia as opposed to, say, Libya at the moment, or even Egypt? Now, I know Egypt technically is not Maghreb per se, but if you look at a map that I've got on the board there, we can't separate ourselves in these colonial boundaries, can we? We need to look at a region. So why is China focusing on Tunisia? Why? Why are the Tunisians focusing on China? What has happened? Just laying out the territory, saying this is now what's going on. Tunisia is being invested in by China at a high level is interesting, but what does it mean? Then what is China's stance on Western Sahara? One of the big fights going on in Morocco, we all know, and my country's made big mistakes diplomatically on this, has been the Republic of Western Sahara. China's stance, by the way, is neutral. That's not the AU stance. The AU stance is distinctly not neutral. Why is China's stance on the Western Sahara neutral? We need to talk about that when you talk about what's going on in Morocco and investments in China, because it's the smoking gun. It's the elephant in the room when it comes to diplomatic conversations around stories in the region, in the same way as the question of Palestine is in Israel. Not nice to discuss, but there's the sharp end of the real world. And our job as journalists is to stare straight at the threat and be able to explain the story in a productive and a memorable way and a unique way to people who are on social media all the time, or part of the time, or getting some of the information from places like Facebook. We need to differentiate that. So if we just become another group of Facebook I like, don't like stories, then we are not seeing the strategy used by a nation state that is the second biggest economy in the world, that is looking at Tunisia and Morocco and Algeria and Mauritania, and to some extent Libya, except it got burnt there, as you know. Why is China still investing in Tunisia when they had to send a number of ships to take their workers off of the ports at Libya? Why are they willing to come back and send their workers back to Tunisia to build housing or a tunnel or one of the longest roads in the world in Algeria. Why are they willing to take that chance? Well, the Mediterranean is really important. They're not really interested in spending money on Niger or Senegal or Chad. They're much more interested in spending money on Eritrea, Ethiopia, Libya to some extent, Tunisia, Algeria. These are strategic areas of the world for nation states. And also, the Chinese state does not have a port in the Mediterranean. They tried to buy a port in Greece, couldn't. It was stopped at the last minute. It wanted to buy a port in Crete, also stopped. What's going on in the world? Why are we telling the story? When we tell the story about the investments into a region from a nation state, we must be able to ask the questions about that. So mapping. Now, this is not a very good, I just quickly went to a mapping tool and whipped together this and just put it on the slide to show you how you could maybe tell the story another way by visualizing a map. This, I use something called Picture Chart. I'll put it in the chat at the end of this. I'm sure you've met it. It's unfortunately an app designed in English, but you can use Arabic or French or anything else into this app. The big thing is it creates automatic maps for you to use so you can explain things to people and show, right, this is the Maghreb. This is why China is here. This is why Algeria is important to them. I mean, one of the stories spoke about a small town in the desert area in mid-south of Algiers, for example. It's kind of not, it has 48-degree summer times and is not regarded as strategic other than the fact that it's on a couple of important trade routes. So I thought that story, for example, showing the picture of where the town was versus other towns and why. Some of the stories were about roads, infrastructure. Show us a picture of where the roads go. Why are these roads being built between these countries by a nation state or invested in by the nation state? I thought that using a visualization, a map of some sort would really, really help. Then I saw many open doors on stories where it kind of, the door opened like, and I looked through at something that was big and it was closed. So when you spot something as a journalist that doesn't look right, it isn't. So for example, here's a quote from one of the stories. My father is a civil engineering graduate who worked with a Chinese company which left immediately after the work was completed. No media outlet was able to obtain any permits connected to the project, any details of implementation, or the extent of its response to the issue of its suitability to the climate, local climate, and energy efficiency. That was just one paragraph, and then that was that. I'm like thinking, really? But what did the father of the civil engineering graduate say? Is he willing to be quoted? Because he's been identified. Why is, hold on a second, there's something in the story I'm not reading. So I accept I'm not from any of these countries, and I may be missing this, the subtleties, perhaps. But that's a door that's open. And I'm waiting, okay, let me walk through this door. What's going on here? So here are the questions. Why? Why were the permits secret? What was behind the lack of, this is the one paragraph question you can ask. What was behind the lack of transparency? Why were they doing that? Who gave the order to keep these things hidden? Is this some kind of like process thing that takes place in these investments? I need to know. If I can't find out, I at least need to ask the question and get the reader to say, well, what do you think? What independent thinking analysis? Who else is talking about this? Where do we go for more information? Who can tell me more about this? If you can't say anymore, you need to say that. Journalists have been threatened. The last people who wrote about this lost their job. This is a sensitive story. I'm afraid we cannot do it more. Or more importantly, you just don't mention it at all. And it's lovely. It's public relations, PR. You're writing nation state PR for the nation state, and they're going to give you lots of free trips to many, many parts of the world, and so on. So when you open that door to a journalist and say, hey, no one could get information on this project. So we don't even know how suitable those buildings are for the climate. Or will the bridge crack in 50-degree heat? Or will it need coal-powered energy in a desert climate that's suited to solar or whatever? I don't know any of those things. I've just got a point here that's made. You need to, when you ask questions of authority like this, we all need to squeeze them for the facts. And yes, I've said this, and I know that it's easy enough. You'd say it's easy enough for you. You live in Johannesburg. And I'm trying to explain that my world of journalism stretches throughout Africa, doing stories across the continent where things have gone wrong. And I've been physically in danger because of that. From police to rich people who don't like the fact that you're exposing their oppression. So part of the project about asking questions is to get people to read and realize that there's something going on that is publicly identifiable and that they are empowered, therefore, to take action of some sort. And as I said at the start, I'm finishing off, is just at the end, is visualization. Being able to visualize a number or a group of things or a place and compare it or give it some power by describing a change in the process is really, really important. So here's, I just use a little app on the presentation tool. It's got an edit chart data app. And I put in the first number that I read in this thing, which says, this one story said China's investments in the MENA countries dramatically increased from around 77.45 billion up to 2012 to 120.6 billion in the next 7 years. First 7 years is around 77. The next 7 years, it goes up almost 300%. Now you can see that that little graph there doesn't really explain that. It's just a little fat blue pie, a fat blue graph. But that little red line explains something. Obviously, the story that you write from visualization point of view is what's going to happen. I'm just going to grab this thing. Is it going to do this? Is it going to do that? Is it going to, what is going to happen? Is it going to just do this? And then maybe it'll flatten out. This line will then flatten out here because it's 2 years since 2020. So maybe we'll get more information and paint that picture. So what is the trend? And the trend explains the thing I started off with here, which is hypothesis, data comparison, and the strategy. The trend in expenditure explains the strategy. So even the stories that we're looking at, color pieces, where you were focusing on the cultural exchange, for example, one story did a cultural exchange. You can throw in the big picture story and say, one of the things that's happened to culture and the cultural exchange is, if you buy a cultural item from cities in South Africa now, some of the cultural items are no longer made in South Africa. They're imported. And they're at the heart of the culture. So the story is, it can be told in a visualized way to show how the data, the chunks of data that were being quoted in the stories, there are big chunks of these huge numbers, can be broken down and then ask, the simple question is, what does it mean? Who gains, who loses? What's happened over the long term? What's happening elsewhere, not just in Maghreb, but perhaps in the neighboring states? What's happening to African manufacturers, just a little further south? So I thought that using these very simple tools is quite hard to do. The easiest thing to do is to go to the official or the bureaucrat or the government minister, get a number and put it in a story and say, there it is. There is the number. It's a big number, isn't it? It's very big. And then someone would say, yes, it is big. And then you go, well, this is what it means. That's our job, is to go, this is what it means. And then that's the hypothesis. So you can move away from bias and subjective opinion based on the fact that you can look at a number, compare it with another number, or a time period of those investments, and a picture forms very clearly. And then you have to ask the question about, what am I seeing here? And more importantly for us in journalism, and you and I know this, what's going to happen? People pay you and I lots of money not to tell them what happened, to tell them what's going to happen. Too many of our colleagues are very good at telling people what happened, but have no idea about what's going to happen. If you look at visualization, you know what's going to happen, likely to happen. You can see that trend. And the average person who's reading our story must suddenly realize that's what it means and be excited by it, when their lives must change because of it. So I was amazed at the stories I read, the amount of information that the journalists, the diverse journalists doing different kinds of story on different platforms, the amount of material they got in the quotes. And then I was equally amazed at the fact that there was no attempt to ask the question, what does this mean? And I'll be very excited to see some of those stories, the results of that, answering that question, because you can see that it's really important questions. Why is Tunisia and Algeria, why are the investments on the Belt and Road Initiative in particular focusing on these areas, not Egypt so much? What's going on? Is it just about resources? No, it can't be, because as we've been told, the petroleum imports into China are negligible in terms of their strategic gains. So what else are they wanting from Tunisia and Algeria if it's not the oil, or it's not access to oil? What strategic need do these countries, the US, European countries and so on, need from us? That's what I need to read. I'm a thinking person reading your stories like, oh, now I understand. It's better than having a thumbsuck where I'm thinking, I wonder if it could mean this, because then I have bias problems as a reader. I'm like, that means that the Chinese are doing this, which doesn't mean at all, because I just haven't had the question answered. But why are they doing this? So why is it happening over this period? So I know that you'll tell me, hopefully some will tell me, look, Desmond, my story was just a story about that. And I always say to people, your story is never disconnected from everything else. There are always connections about the climate, about the people, about the money flow, about the region, about the cultures. There's always connections. Whether it's a French person writing about Algeria or a Chinese person writing about Algeria, they're connected by Algeria. Now, what do the Algerians think about the French or think about the Chinese? That's missing. It's much easier to write in a post-colonial way now about what the Algerians think about the French than it is to write about what the Algerians think about the Chinese. Because the judge is still not sure about the second question. The judge is very sure about the first question, colonialism. But the second one, is it colonialism? What is it? Is it resource colonialism? What am I seeing here? This is a country that was colonized by the British. China, part of it was colonized by the British and the Americans and plundered. So you can see it's very complex. And our world is so full of this kind of story. So I wanted to say, if I can read them again in the future with those answers, I'd really like to. All of those stories that I read and saw, the videos that I saw, have this question built in at the background. So I felt that a lot of hard work was done by our colleagues to get the information about what is happening. But why is happening, I'm not sure. And I'd like to read more from your point of view about what you think is happening in those countries that and the regions that you're writing about, rather than it's happening. There's the money, there's the house, that's the plan. Okay, so that's my presentation. I'm sorry I cannot speak Arabic or French properly. I've been learning French for 2 years and I'm still pathetic. But if you'd like to have a chat with me in Is it Xhosa, we can have a go. Are there any questions?
تحدثت كثيرا إلا أن الميكرو كان يعني منقطع. كنت بصدد القول. شكرا لك. شكرا أستاذ ديزموند وأستاذة باولا على تقديم الأدوات لرواية الخبر التي يخدم الجمهور المستخدم، العناصر التي ننظر فيها عند مراجعة القصة أو الخبر، عملية التقييم وكيفية تقديم البيانات أيضا، وأهم الملاحظات التي رأيتها حول الأخبار المكتوبة في شمال إفريقيا من خلال الأمثلة المذكورة، وفي الأخير أهمية العرض المرئي للمعلومات ومقارنة البيانات في إعداد التقارير. أحيل الكلمة الآن للصحفيين والصحفيات الموجودين معنا. إن كانت لديكم أسئلة أو ملاحظات حول المداخلة أو هذه الجلسة الثانية بصفة عامة، أو هل لديكم ملاحظات ختامية قبل انتهاء هذه الجلسة واليوم الأول من التدريب؟ أحيل لكم الكلمة. معنا يسر وتوفيق، أظن أن راقية لديها بعض المشاكل التقنية. هل لديكم إضافات يسر أو توفيق حول هذه الجلسة؟ توفيق يريد التدخل. هل لديك مشكل في الإنترنت؟ يمكن الكتابة عبر ديسكوسيون وأنا سأوصل سؤالك أو تقييمك.
نعم، شكرا روعة، شكرا للأستاذ والأستاذة على التدخل. سؤال فقط للأستاذ مدام تطرق إلى طبيعة العلاقات المتينة ما بين الجزائر وتونس والصين الشعبية، ففعلا هي علاقة متينة يعني منذ القدم، منذ أن اعترفت الصين بالجزائر في 1958 كأول دولة غير عربية تعترف بالجزائر وبجمهورية الجزائر. وأيضا طبيعة العلاقة أن الجزائر ساعدت كثيرا الصين في استعادة مقعدها بهيئة الأمم المتحدة في 1971. أيضا في تحولات كثيرة منذ سنة 2014 إلى غاية اليوم، يعني من خلال المبادلات التجارية السياسية العسكرية وكذا يعني المبادلات السياحية والثقافية. فقط أردت أن أطرح سؤال للأستاذ حول يعني ألا يرى بأن طبيعة العلاقات المتينة ما بين دولة ودولة أخرى تساعد كثيرا في وتساهم كثيرا في إعطاء مناخ خصب لإعداد التقارير والوثائقيات والأنواع الصحفية أو الروبورتاجات أو حتى التحقيقات ولما لا التحقيقات الاستقصائية، خاصة ونحن في بعض الدول العربية وليست بعضها وإنما أغلبها نعاني كثيرا من شح المعلومة ومن مصدر المعلومة الموثوق، فلا يقول أن هذه العلاقات المتينة تسهل نوعا ما في الحصول على المعلومة مقارنة بالعلاقات الغير متينة والعلاقات المضطربة نوعا ما بين الدول، يعني عكس ذلك، بمعنى أنها لا تعطي ذلك المناخ الذي يساعدك في الحصول على مصادر المعلومة. وأنا أردت أن أطرح هذا السؤال نظرا لأنه الأستاذ تكلم على يعني على المصدر، على الحصول على المعلومة من مصدرها. فقط هذا هو السؤال الذي أردت أن أقوله.
Thank you very much, Chuflik. I mean, I don't think that the relationship between the two countries alone would necessarily lead to a really good story. I think one of the things that we really are looking for in storytelling is not simply a kind of the dichotomy of this is what we say, this is what China says, but really a range of different voices, different perspectives in it. So when I talk about the sources, I'm not simply saying that you must have opposite views in your story. What we really are looking for are yes, different views, but also views of people from different perspectives, different areas, different issues. for me, the issue about the source is that it's not enough to simply have two sources, that you really do want to have more than that, so that the ethical storytelling is to seek the truth and tell it as fully as possible. And so they're never just two sides to a story, they are more than two sides. So I agree that potentially, given that there are good relationships between the two countries, that it should give a good story. But there are also other views, right? Like Lena's view, or people like it, or the people on the ground, you know, who I was talking about earlier on, you know, when you look at the low trade numbers with China, it's surprising because it just seems like there's just so many Chinese goods in the country. You know, that's a different view, a different source. And so even in today's session, you know, there's just so many different voices that are coming up. And so I would encourage any journalist to not be satisfied with only two sides, to actually, you know, to dig and get more voices and get more views that add richness to their story. But particularly, I think it's the worker on the ground, the consumer on the ground, the people on the ground that really add value to the story also. I hope that helps, Stefan.